All right. No, thanks
But
for
if we've
coming.
got good enough audio here with the setup, we'll just go with it as is.
Yeah, I think we can all hear you pretty well now. Can you hear me all right, Hunter?
Yeah, you're fine.
All right. No, thanks for coming down to chat to the team today. I really appreciate your time. How did you want to run this? Did you want to go over the questions that we sent you first? Because I know they're probably going to be like top of mind. You've already got them in front of you, and that could be an easy way to run it. And then I guess if we've got any other questions after that, we can ask them. But do you want to give the team a quick little rundown about who you are and what you're currently doing, what you've done in the past, etc., etc.?
Yeah, sure. Did you have your did your team have your beers ready for the Friday for the happy hours?
Oh, if anyone wants to get a beer, get it out of the fridge, 100%.
Cool.
Hey,
There you go. Well, hey, afternoon tea. That's a good place for it. It's all good. So yeah, first of all, thanks for the invites. I did meet a few of you a couple of weeks ago, and it was great to see you in person and do all that, catching up. For those that I hadn't gotten a chance to meet, my name is Hunter Boyle. I'm the co-founder of Copilot Crew. We're actually on the verge of celebrating our 4-year anniversary here. Came to Australia 7 years ago, left AWeber and started Optimization Copilot, which was largely consulting for growth optimization around CRO, different types of EDM, automation, and digital marketing channels. And over those first few years where I worked with a lot of clients like Catch and a lot of clients in the e-commerce space, one thing that started to happen was a lot of the clients wanted more on the execution side. And while that kept growing, I really wanted to kind of balance what I was doing with the strategy and the analysis and the deep dive and testing and those sorts of things. So a few years ago, we changed and I got the band back together with my partner, Candice DeVille, and created Copilot Crew. So we've sort of fused the best parts of strategy and consulting, analytics and business intelligence with the managed growth services, particularly paid search, paid social, conversion optimization, email automation, and those channels are kind of our primaries, but we do look sort of across the board in like a T-shaped or an M-shaped approach to growth. And yeah, like I said, we are just on the verge of our 4-year anniversary as Copilot Crew. I just ticked over 7 years here in Australia. It's been going great. We work with a lot of fantastic clients who are upper to small and mid-sized businesses. And we prefer to take a quality versus quantity approach. So we never work with more than 10 clients at a time. We keep our core team nice and lean, and then we are scalable to work with the different types of clients on the different projects. Some of them have internal marketing teams. Some of them, we are their marketing team. So we can flex and work in a couple of different ways, but the ultimate goal is always great results. So we get them, we're having fun, it's working well, it's all good.
awesome.
Sweet, nice one. Sounds like you've been in the game for quite a while, Hunter. But
Long
yeah.
time.
Yeah, no. So, do you just want to jump into those questions that we sent over? I know there was about 5 or 6 different questions from the team, and then
Sure,
I
you
guess
can
we
run them
can
down, do whatever you want.
yeah, we'll probably have more questions after that. So,
Sure. Do an AMA. We'll just throw
yeah,
it, and we'll do some lightning rounds and see how we go.
yeah. All right. So I'll just get up to questions quickly. Yeah, I mean, the first question, I think this was from Matt or Georgia, is what's the best way to test CRO changes without actually doing A/B testing? Like if the client had some restrictions around like implementation of some tracking code to do A/B testing, or they didn't want to utilize the full functionality of it.
That's a great question. I love that one. And to whoever on the team sent it in, and by the way, all the questions that you sent were really good. So a lot of sharp thinking, which is great. On the A/B testing side, one thing I think is really important for people to understand is that a lot of times CRO is confused with specifically or almost always A/B or multivariate testing, right? And there's a lot more to it that can be done, particularly with a lot of the different workarounds that you need to take when companies have obstacles, whether it's low traffic, lack of technical resources. There are a whole variety of things that can alter tests generally, seasonality threats, other kinds of validity threats, those sorts of things. And it affects small and large businesses. So even when I was working with Catch some years ago, plenty of team, plenty of budget, great tools, but some of the things that had been happening in the tests when I got there that really need to be worked out were things that you just need to adjust from your testing strategy, whether it's A/B or multivariate. So if you're thinking about kind of working around some of those types of limitations, I would say the first thing to think about is thinking about opportunities and prioritize opportunities that are not just A/B test specific. And I'll give you one example. For one client that we are working with, and it wasn't doing CRO specifically, it was doing paid traffic channels and growth with some paid social, with some EDM, and then the landing pages and the campaigns that were involved. Even aside from setting up an A/B test, when we looked at both the analytics and some of the qualitative data on the way that the funnel had been set up, we added a secondary conversion event to the thank you page. So not the landing page, not the campaign itself, but some changes that we made just right to the thank you page and added a next level conversion event to that one. Had about 119% conversion lift from the first time that we rolled that out. We didn't split test it because it was more of a sequential. It's more of a monthly campaign sequence, but that's a great example of how it doesn't even require an A/B test at the initial stage to get those kinds of gains and results. So looking for opportunities within different buying journeys is one of the first places to start. And really that comes back to looking at the qualitative analytics, like your Hotjar or your heat maps, those sorts of things, as well as some of the quantitative, like Google Analytics, drop-off rates, funnel, those sorts of things. You don't even need BWO or Optimizely for some of those kinds of things. You can just dive right in, start to make some educated guesses based on experience, what you're seeing from a user experience standpoints, and then start to formulate some of those opportunities.
Yeah, nice one. I think there's so much to CRO. It's kind of like SEO. It's such a diverse area as well. But I mean, what are some common CRO mistakes to look out for? Like, what have you seen over the years that you say would be the biggest mistakes with CRO campaigns?
So dovetailing on what I was just talking about, I think one of the ones is thinking about everything has to be a test and everything has to be moving around elements on the page, right? Like, so 12 years ago, when I was leading content marketing at Marketing Experiments and Mech Labs, right, which is one of the pioneering agencies in conversion optimization. A lot of the things that we talked about on our webinars and our case studies with clients like New York Times, Royal Bank of Canada, and other sort of large enterprise clients were some of the tactical level tests that were done, right? So changes on the landing page, things above the fold. You know, HubSpot is famous for its, its button color tests and those sorts of things. And a lot of times what has happened over the course of the past 10 to 15 years with CRO, as it's gotten a lot more known, is it's kind of followed a similar path to SEO in some ways, where you can just look at a couple of the really granular nuts and bolts factors. But if you're not thinking about the big picture, then more often than not, you'll be approaching it from a very faulty perspective, right? And this is even a conversation that's been going on. And I've seen this on LinkedIn recently here a little bit in terms of, the culture of testing and a larger baked in optimization mindset across marketing and across product internally for larger companies versus making, a dozen tests or 20 different tests and trying to just rack up a bunch of quick incremental wins that are fast and easy. So there are trade-offs from each approach. And even in cases where companies try to look at CRO, whether internally or with an agency, as something that is just moving a few tactical pieces on the board rather than thinking about the larger buyer journey and some of the things that aren't just A/B tests, like positioning, how you fit into your competitive marketplace, and not just page elements or those sorts of things, but other things that can be either tested or changed or both, is probably the biggest fork in the road for, I think, CRO pitfalls. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. What type of tools would you recommend for A/B testing? Like, what are some top tools on the market that you're recommending at the moment? Like, what are the best things that you'd recommend agencies or freelancers or anyone to use if they said what are the top tools at the moment? Because I know the tools are always changing too. I remember years ago there was tools around, and then they get acquired, and then they sometimes shut the tools down, and all sorts of shenanigans.
Yeah. So they do tend to change, like you said, in terms of a couple of the OGs are a bit more on the steady side. What we find we use in this kind of tool set most often are still VWO, Google Optimize for larger companies and in-house. Sometimes it's Optimizely or Convert. Sometimes there are a few other ones that come up here and there. And then there are other platforms that have testing sort of baked in a different way, like Unbounce, or the way that HubSpot uses its testing for different platforms, ClickFunnels. Those Instapage lead pages tend to be the most common. But basically, in terms of recommending tools, I always say that it's just like trying to choose a car, right? So there's functionality and there's practicality, but then there's also feel and fit and the user experience. Like, if you don't like the feel of a BMW or a Mercedes just because it is a luxury brand, if you're feeling better in a Toyota, or if you're feeling better in a Honda or something else, then if that's going to get you where you want to be, feeling the right way, that you can learn the tool and use the UX to your advantage, then that's the best one. This is a lot of times what we were sort of, when I was with AWeber, we were getting into versus Constant Contact and MailChimp, like which one is best for you. Really, if it comes down to something that you're going to use or something that you're going to be confused about, that's a big difference. Is there live support? Is there really proactive support for something like VWO or Optimizely? There are. For things like Optimize, not as much. So those kinds of things factor into the equation. But like a CRM, any other sort of software platform, it's really a pretty individualized choice. But within that, those are the big names that generally are getting the job done. And on the qualitative side, Hotjar has really, come on in the last few years, where Crazy Egg used to be something we're using about 8-9 years ago. A lot more often it's been Hotjar. Now Microsoft has got Clarity. So there are a few in that set, not quite as many, but those are some of the ones that generally come to mind.
What are some common SEO ramifications of using like CRO or A/B testing? I've seen people do silly things where they'll make 3 versions of a homepage, and then they'll have them all indexed or something like that. They don't canonicalize it. What have you seen? Any SEO horror stories from using CRO implementation or tools and stuff like that?
SEO horror stories. I can't tell you I have an SEO specific horror story. So some platforms like VWO and the way that they sort of split the traffic are, they work on keeping the SEO impact out of the mix, and even where tools like SEMrush and some of the other ones are trying to increasingly guide people to understanding A/B testing for SEO, right? Which I think is a really interesting area in how you can kind of start to look at the impact for on page to make sure that it improves conversions without hurting SEO is something that takes a lot of, it takes a bit more consideration than just sort of flying fast and loose. But like I said, we take a bit more of a quality versus quantity approach. So rather than just trying to test, max out volume, really putting some of that prep work in front to make sure that the kinds of negative impacts on organic or any other specific channel don't get too far out of hand to like horror story level are a big part of why I haven't really worked on any of those firsthand. So it's a great question. I wish I could give you a horror story on that side, but a bit more on the SEO horror story side seems to be a little bit more in terms of just some of the general direction and the acceleration of Google algorithm updates, particularly over the past year or so, like within Australia, and just kind of how even with expanding, the ads pack up top, the local pack, people also ask, and the other kinds of changes that Google has made to try and keep more of the traffic either on Google and on the initial SERPs has kind of impacted SEO, even where companies that still have like #1 and #2 rankings are finding that those rankings are still starting to diminish in terms of volume and quality in some respects there because of some of those changes. So that's kind of an interesting area that I see a bit more than sort of the crossover between CRO and SEO blowing up one another,
I think for head terms, there's been a bit of a squeeze with some of the head term related keywords, but I think the thing about SEO is like the long tail is so huge. So there's so much traffic in the long tail, and like still 80 to 85% of the clicks inquiries are going for SEO traffic. So paid, they're always trying to squeeze a bit more out, but I think the prices are going up on paid search too. So it's a tricky one.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I mean, that's a tricky one in itself. But have you seen any good CRO case studies like in the past, or what would you recommend our team look at if we want to see a deep dive or a case study into some research about CRO and where someone's really gone in detail and showed like what works and what hasn't worked? And I presume it would be different based on the different niches that you're in. Like what might convert better in like a retirement village might be completely different to a TikTok teens type website,
Yeah, definitely. So there are always two places that I recommend for people really trying to learn conversion optimization from that in-depth perspective. So one, I'm still a bit biased because having worked there and having run the marketing experiments case studies for a couple of years, several years ago, they've continued. And so marketing experiments is very much a great long-running resource for people who, let's say, are probably a bit more analytically inclined. So one of the sort of trade-offs with the process was it was pretty deep on kind of the scientific approach and the heuristics and that kind of thing that were used. Tried to lighten it up a little bit and make sure that the case studies were understandable and intuitive and transformative. But there's still a lot of really good research there. And I was with them in 2008 to 2010, and that had already been going for a while. So by now there's probably about, I think, 15 to maybe 20 years worth going back. The newer ones are obviously a lot more valuable, but just in terms of that longer view, that's a good one. The other one that I always recommend is CXL, like formerly Conversion XL, which took the same kind of model and I thought really did a great job of making a lot of the case studies super transferable and putting a lot of great content and posts together, as well as some of the training and some of the other aspects for conversion optimization, and then growing into a couple more of the channel areas. So those are two that I always recommend. There's a lot of other places to find case studies. Agencies have some, other sorts of sites have some. Marketing Sherpa does a great job with case studies. It's just not as focused on CRO specifically. It's broader in terms of marketing, but those are a couple that I would always highly recommend.
Sweet, no, some good ones. What's your normal process for doing like a CRO audit or assessment, and how do you best go about getting those recommendations implemented? For like a larger business, it could be potentially a bit tricky to get certain things implemented.
Mhm.
How do you go about it with
So yeah, that's a great question. I would probably liken it from what I'm pretty certain is your experience with starting on SEO engagements, right? Which is, I'm assuming here, but one thing that we do is look at the quantitative and the qualitative. Like I mentioned, we look to get a full spectrum approach and really understand both what analytics is telling us, and that goes for Google Analytics plus any other kind of platform analytics, whether it's Shopify or WooCommerce or HubSpot, in lead gen situations, and really look at those numbers plus the qualitative, right? So if Hotjar is there, if they've run surveys, if we have things that we can look at for video sessions, and we can find segments, trends, other kinds of markers, and other sorts of indicators. And then we look at the competitive research, and we look at things like Lighthouse, for example, and look at things like site speed and how they can be impacting things in GSC, visibility. So we get that larger view, and then we really start to distill down what the findings are from both sides. We try and sort of slice and dice those in a couple of different ways and look for segment opportunities. For example, desktop versus mobile, new versus return, channels, other sorts of things. And then we really try to figure out, depending on what stage the client is at with testing, if there's already a testing strategy or a platform or a plan in place, like some clients have had Optimizely or VWO, we look at a bit of that history, and then what's been working, what hasn't been working, what we would do to fix it. If there is none, what that takes to get that up to speed and move it from that point forward. And that's really what we work on to develop our optimization plans, action plans. We use a prioritization model. It's a bit of a blend between something like an ICE score or a PXL score. There are a couple variants. We have our own that's just a little bit different than some of those standardized ones. And then we map out what that testing plan looks like, what the assets are going to be, what the costs and budgets are going to kind of take, what channels we would use. And then we look at what that looks like over about 3 to 6 month periods, depending on things like volume, those sorts of things, capabilities. And then we start to go from there.
Nice one. Like, what are some key considerations when creating a conversion funnel? Like, are there any traps for like in A/B testing should be aware of, and like how often would you be running an A/B test, and like what pages are the best place to start? I know there's a few questions there myself.
Yeah. So those, I'll sort of break down those three like individually. Like
Yeah.
the first one, I think, was in terms of how do we kind of map it out, right? Was that your
Yeah, like
was that the first part of that three-parter?
how do you go about creating a conversion funnel? Like what are some key considerations when you create it?
Great question. So a lot of times it's already there to some degree. I mean, it's occasional. It's rare. It does happen that we build or rebuild websites. But like I started hand coding websites decades ago, and I don't build them from scratch or build them from the ground up that much anymore in terms of kind of taking optimization from what's already there. Most of the time, particularly with the clients that we work with, they're already generating significant revenue. So, I mean, they have conversion funnels or buyer journeys in place. So we're not usually creating those from scratch. What we're often trying to do is figure out throughout any step of that process, before, during, after, where the opportunities really are. So we have clients, for example, that are, it's ranges from like single page conversions, and those kinds of things can be lead generation. Email sign up is one goal, right? Another one is purchase. So e-commerce, there are a couple of like 2-step cards. Some are 5-step funnels, right? Some are 2-step lead gen. So thinking about those as one part, that's kind of like the middle. The other parts that we take into account are before that, like where the channels and the campaigns are coming from, because that's a super important part of conversion optimization, is that relevance, right? If you have a totally different message on your paid search campaign or paid social campaign, and let's say you're just pointing people to the homepage instead of landing page, then you're already getting an opportunity to improve the relevance in the match, right? On the paid search side, that improves the quality score. On the paid social side, the relevance, all those sorts of things are an example of like that first step. But the conversion funnel on the site usually exists. So whether that's 1 step, 2 steps, 5 steps, or more, that's kind of where we look for those opportunities. And then the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of times, which conversion optimization doesn't always take into account, the visits to your site. From your perspective in SEO, what do you think a good bounce rate is?
I don't know, a good bounce rate potentially depends on the industry that you're in. Different industries have different bounce rates, but
Of course, but just a general, just like a,
I don't know, like I'd say something like 5% or 10%. I don't know. It really depends on the industry. I don't know. What's
well, even
everyone
if
else's
you're,
there? It's such a industry dependent kind of thing.
exactly. Well, even if you're kind of thinking about what we see a lot of times, and it depends on the site and those sorts of things, but whatever the bounce rates may be, if they're 10, 20, 30%, sometimes 40%, it's fairly common. If you think about that and you think about how things like email or remarketing or other sorts of channels can bring visitors back even ahead of or right after a micro conversion event, those are the kinds of things that also start to add up and aggregate for a larger conversion event, right? Whether it's remarketing, whether it's just signing up for an email now for, let's say, a larger average order value or that sort of thing. Like for a, we have some clients that have like a $30,000 average order value, right? People aren't necessarily just coming to the website, whether it's through any channel, and then just automatically going, here's my 30K for this quite high-end product. We have some other ones that are in the 14 to 15K range, similar thing. Sometimes that's a quote, sometimes that's email, sometimes that's getting people onto the social channel so that they can be nurtured in different ways and remarketed and those sorts of things. And all of those are part of like taking the longer view for conversion optimization. So when we think of funnels, that's a bit of the way that we think about them a bit differently than a lot of agencies and a lot of CROs. So that one is one that's, like I said, we really take some extra time up front to figure out that approach and then make sure that we've got the full picture, because that's really ultimately what we're trying to do. So like conversions are one thing, but whether that's an email or whether that's a lead or whether that is an e-commerce, a sale, that isn't where CRO stops for us. We look at things like average order value, average customer lifetime value, sales conversion rates, like what happens with the sales team after lead gen, customer lifetime value and retention, churn rates for SaaS clients, and those sorts of things. So taking that 30,000-foot view and then really zeroing in on a couple of the best opportunities and prioritizing those is how we kind of think about like the funnel and where to go with that. So I think that was part one of your 3-parter. Remind me what 2 and 3 were again. Sorry.
Are there any pitfalls and traps with A/B testing we should be aware of? Like
Yeah, there's
pitfalls and traps.
there's like a dozen validity threats. There's some really good blog posts out there on that. We did some marketing experiments, some on CXL, the sites I mentioned, but things like overlapping tests with different campaigns, right? Like seasonality indicators, or mudding the data in the traffic waters, either between campaigns, between channels, or things like looking at year over year, period versus period. And there was a website redesign, there was a special campaign or a special discount or those sorts of things. A lot of times, because marketing teams are just go and trying to get more and more done, it's easy for a lot of those things to slip through the cracks, right? So when you're kind of setting those up, or when you're analyzing those, or when you're kind of looking at how those types of recent or not as recent events can impact your testing, keeping an eye on like the top 10 validity threats is probably the biggest one. The other one I would say is not getting to statistical significance. So understanding the probability, the 95% and up, rather than, it's not unusual for some executives or some others that are kind of looking at conversion optimization and tests. If they're not going well, like right off the bat, it's kind of like the stock market, right? If you're checking your stocks every single day or every hour, you're hitting refresh. Right now, last couple of months, you'd be getting a little bit nervous, right?
Yeah.
Right.
You don't want to log in.
A lot of times it takes time for tests to hit the statistical significance. So those sort of fluctuations in the early sort of ups and downs that you can see if you're just sort of launching, and then you're checking back in a couple of hours to make sure that the data is recording properly. And then if you're checking like the next day and the next day after that, and you're seeing it go, you see some pretty wild swings sometimes for various reasons. For example, one client we have has probably about 50 to 60% of their transactions happen towards the front end of the week, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, right? And then it just starts to drop off, and then the weekend is really low, right? So things like taking into consideration when you launch a test and thinking about those sorts of things and that kind of impact is another good example of, just the details that you have to keep in mind. So it's a mix of attention to detail, but not getting too lost in the weeds on the granular side. Those are, I think, the biggest ones to sort of keep in mind with CRO and the pitfalls. It's a great question too.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions here actually. Everyone's very, very interested in CRO, but I think the final one in that series of questions was, what's the best page to start for a test? Is it the home page? Is it a product page? And also to add to that question, this is just something I was thinking about when now you've been talking to us. Is there a minimum traffic threshold that you'd say a site would need to have to engage with like CRO services? Because you see these CRO agencies and they're like, we won't talk to you unless you have 10,000 visitors a month, So, 10,000 visitors a day or something. I forget the number, but like, I guess that's to add to another two-part question.
Yeah. I'll take the traffic one first there. Just sort of, I'll flip the order on that one just because. So it is fairly common to have like a bit of a 10K minimum for visitors. Because really with statistical significance, what you want to try and do is get like 1,000 conversion events. So even at a small percentage, ideally you'll want to have 10,000 visitors per month. And that's kind of where I was saying, when we think about conversion optimization and it not just being A/B testing, because when you split up that audience, even in some cases like 40,000 a month, it may hit a minimum, but depending on the tests that you're trying to run, this is where it kind of dovetails with the other part of your question and what page you would try and use. It's really a balance, right? So in your same kind of response to what a good bounce rate is or what an average bounce rate is, it's very, very specific to a lot of different business factors. So in terms of getting an A/B test up and running, you can do it with 10,000 volume per month, and you could certainly even do some tests with a little bit less than that. If you're using something like paid search or, a paid social or email, like a dedicated channel, where you have a bit more control over the data than just 10K in aggregate between all sources, you're in a much better place to sort of figure out, okay, what those conversions might be, and you get a bit more confidence in the results. If you don't have those kinds of traffic volume numbers, then working around the A/B testing with sequential testing, right? Which is if you take 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or a month, and you can change different landing pages or key site pages and look at month over month, keeping some of those same validity threats in mind, like seasonality or some of the other ones, it does give you a good enough place to start making improvements, right? There's your ideal case, like the purest level of traffic, A/B testing, and all the sorts of things, just like dialed in and locked in. And then, look, there's what's practical and what companies can try and do as they're trying to grow and get growth, right? Because Amazon can run like 400 tests a day, based on its volume and that sort of thing. Companies that are starting up, whether it's even in the US or Australia or whatever, just those numbers aren't there. So you do what you can, right? And then sort of getting back to the question of what that means for where you start testing, that's where you look for impacts in a similar way to what we would sort of consider for an SEO approach, right? You look at some of the priority of the pages based on impact. Homepage is usually going to be, if not number one, top two or top three. You may have certain landing pages that for whatever reason have like an SEO, higher visibility than your homepage. But, what is the call to action? How does that actually, if it's a blog post that went viral and landed and Google loves it and they put it up into the, people also ask questions, featured snippet, and it's outperforming your homepage in SEO, for example. You might start with that one and try and figure out, okay, what can we do to sort of take people who are coming to the blog and use different calls to action or move them into a conversion funnel from there. The homepage may not be a conversion funnel. As you know, a lot of times homepages try and do a lot of different things, right? Many homepages try and serve several masters. So they're not always the number one conversion page. You may have a couple of other ones that make a better place to start for that reason. And so those are some of the things that you look for in analytics, and then you try and figure out, well, you could do it that way. And another one would be working back from the contact us page or, your form or whatever conversion actual event page. And, you may have high traffic going from the homepage to those pages, but the conversion numbers are really low. So you would start there instead of the homepage. Those are a lot of the factors that go into answering that question on a case-by-case basis rather than just saying page X, Y, and Z, right?
Yeah, well, there's so much to think about with all this CRO stuff. But
is your head hurting? Yes. How's it feeling?
Mate, it's been
ready
a busy
to crack that beer? How you doing?
It's been a busy week. I'm not going to lie, but what recommendations from a CRO point of view would you say for the prosperity media side? Have you had a quick look at it with
Yeah.
Have you got anything that you could to throw at us? You could say, oh, like change this, do this. Like, how can we convert better? Like, we've got people like yourself that come to the site. We want to attract them. What would your recommendations be?
That's great. So I took a little spin and I did, I think it was mostly desktop. Sorry, I didn't get too much on the mobile side, but I did put a little bit of thought into it and where a lot of what you're doing is really good. And again, what you are doing with your sites is specific to a type of kind of conversion and funnel approach that's very different than e-commerce or a lot of other types. So in this case, knowing that as a services type of business and one that is often based a lot on the personal connection, right? I think a lot of what's on the site is looking really good. There are a couple of areas that I thought, well, if I was going to think about a couple of areas to test, usually, like I said, there are a couple of places. If we're looking at the homepage, like the above the fold section, So you've got the team, you've got that image. It's a smaller team on mobile. It's a bigger team on desktop. There are some things that you could do on that one because it is obviously like that first impression. On desktop, it's different than a couple of scrolls on mobile, but maybe there's a video, maybe there's a different headline or tagline or UVP or that sort of thing. You've probably tested a few to get to that point. So it's not always the first line of business, but sometimes even if like a tagline has been there for a year or two or that sort of thing, mixing it up to see how that might go. You've got the social proof on there with the SEMrush little logo on that one, which is great. We know and love SEMrush. Been working with them for years. It means a lot to us, people who are on the client side and may not know SEMrush as a tool, may be more interested in a different type of social proof, like the other ones that you have for the clients or other kinds of star reviews or that sort of thing. As you go down a little bit, you've got, I think it's Matt from HubSpot in there is, that social proof. But then one thing that I noticed is, like I said, this is very much a personality driven business, right? When people are looking to hire us as agencies, they want to know the people a lot of times behind the brand. Some people are just looking for like the biggest brand in the business and that sort of thing. Others are, really looking to know about who they're going to work with and how and that sort of thing. So when I go over to the About Us page, right, I noticed a couple of your team members up top are clickable, and then a few of you aren't. So
we actually
I hope
have
I'm
all
not
the.
talking out of school. You could be working on those sorts of things there.
We
But
are working on that now. We actually have done all the content for those pages.
there you
I
go.
don't know if Daniel was on the call, but he was in charge of that one. But we might have to. We've done those pages. They're ready to go up. We're actually also making a change to the homepage of the site too at the moment, which is in development.
Okay.
I'll probably get Jeremy, one of our web dev guys, to help implement the rest of those pages because that's definitely something we've already done, and I agree with you. Like we need to finalize that. And then also we're actually adding another 6 boxes to the homepage about areas of specialization.
Okay.
So like we're talking about areas of SEO that we're even getting specialized in, like marketplace, SaaS, finance, crypto. Maybe not crypto anymore. It's gone to hell. But it's dropped right down. We're probably still at it, but like just the key areas of clientele like e-com, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. And then we're even going to try to hone in on those areas because a lot of people, when I find they're searching for SEO or whatever, they're looking for someone who knows it. Like I just had someone message me literally while I've been on the call right now on LinkedIn, and he's like, "Oh, do you guys specialize in marketplace SEO?" Someone like referred us or something, and he's asking like, "How much marketplace SEO do you do?" I'm like, "Mate, we got like a massive page on our website. We've done like 30 projects in that industry, etc., etc." So,
And
yeah.
that's a really good point. The other thing that I was going to say just about the homepage as well was on that services nav, right? So you've got, it looks like there's probably about like 10 or so down there on the nav. So between mobile and desktop, obviously, you would look at, the user sessions and that sort of thing, but like possibly nesting some of those, because when you kind of have a section that's as important in that between home and the services where people drill down, and some will go to About Us and go the personal route, and some will go, the About Us route and sort of, is it's marketplace or can I drill down that way? If you have a lot of options in that one, like there's a lot of, as you know, the speed is not just important from page speed perspective, but how much people can digest and friction levels. And so having like that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many sort of options in the nav under services. So you could test something like nested, or, like you said, you could break out boxes on the homepage and direct people that way. You could do different priorities based on what those subsets may be. So those are a couple of tests that I think might be really worth giving a go. On the About Us side, like I said, making some of those changes and that kind of thing
We got to do
is
that.
like, that's one thing. But even when you get onto like the individual page, like I get to the bottom of those, and there's not a call to action at that one. It just kind of drops me off at the page footer. So using some of those to loop back to either the contact form or that sort of thing. And the third area that I was going to talk about was the way that you've got that set up with the embedded and now the sort of overlay pop out type form version versus some different forms. I mean, there are a lot of different reasons for doing it different ways. If you like the type form and how it sort of gives you the metrics on where people are dropping off or those sorts of things, but form testing and some of those different fields and options like, you know, a selection versus a couple of the other ones, and then the one last thing that I thought was one that I would test too is, again, this is sort of vernacular, right? You've got the let's chat button up there, right? Which is good. I mean,
I don't know if I like let's chat though. That was
Well-
someone that used to work here came up with that. I don't know if I like the wording.
Well, that's exactly my point. The reason it has that Australian edge. So like it sounds right, but at the same time, it could also mean like live chat. And so a lot of people might sort of see that. And then if it says let's chat, even though it's at the top versus where we usually see chat buttons, there's still a chance that people might see it.
Yeah, that's
way.
a good point.
Testing a couple versus the other, that's kind of where some of those like vernacular changes, just even a small word or two, like in some of those kinds of things are some of the ones that would be worth looking at based on where your analytics are and those sorts of things and you know,
Yeah.
whatever else you got going on.
I don't like let's chat. I don't even know why we decided to use that. I think you're right. It wanted to have it more sounding like Aussie, you know, like let's have a chat. Because I was thinking like book a strategy call. Because I think we did test some stuff like where we had like book a strategy call, book a free strategy call, and I don't know, like I don't know. What would you recommend instead of let's chat? Because I know like contact us, maybe is that too corporate or what
I
do
don't
you
know. I
think is
mean, we use
what?
Let's Talk, but I mean, really, like, there's just a set of, you know, it's you can book a call or contact us, or I mean, there are a few that are pretty standard, and then a couple of sites they sort of go like off the beaten path. It just depends partly on what you feel like, what fits with your brands, what you want to sort of test and see what works, and then, I mean, with something like that, the great part is. Actually, what this reminds me of one other kind of aspect to one of your earlier questions, right? With one of the testing pitfalls, right? And even the question that you asked about how many tests like to run, A/B tests, right? Here's one where those two areas dovetail. If you're not segmenting your tests specifically for new traffic versus return, the last thing you want to do is make your site like just constantly running different tests and your repeat users are getting a different site experience in some way, like every time they show up. You know how Facebook used to just change things on the UX and people would notice and then they would announce it like a day later and people were like, what the hell happened to my news feed? Right.
I think the site's hacked. Or like
Yeah.
it could
Yeah.
be
Or
a
like,
phishing attempt.
where did you move this? Like, this is where I went for this. And now it's like all over the place. So when it comes to testing, that's one of the other pitfalls. Like, you can't just try and test to get the optimal experience at the point of alienating your, you know, return audience, particularly like SaaS or clients that are coming back regularly to like use a tool or feature or shopping, that sort of thing. So in this case, the kinds of tests that I'm talking about for your site are ones that most of your clients probably aren't coming back to your site on a regular basis. You know, they find you, they determine, hey, Prosperity is the team that we want to work with, that sort of thing. They come on board. They might come back, you know, for the blog or the newsletter, that sort of thing. But generally, they're not doing that experience again. So the kinds of tests that we're talking about would not be running into that kind of pitfall. You could make some of those pretty quickly and easily without sort of, you know, interfering with a repeat visitor segment experience. So reminded me of one of the other pitfalls. So it was good. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Can I interject with a question quickly?
Do you have the talking stick? How do you How did you, how'd
Whoever
you want
wants
to
to
go?
jump in can jump in. I'm easy.
Is this a question about why the Celtics lost to the Warriors, or are we
I
going
don't want to speak
you
about
want to
that.
keep it CRO side? That's cool.
Impressive.
Yeah, go for it.
So with like buttons or setting up buttons, have you ever run a test of like putting the keyword in the like call to action on a button or something like that, or like?
Sorry, it just lost you when you were asking about what about on the button? Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, like so like when you're writing up like a call to action or like designing a button, for example.
Yeah.
Have you ever tested like putting the keyword within it versus like instead of like chat to us or like let's chat? Have you ever thought about like or like tried testing like let's chat about SEO services or?
I haven't thought about something that specific, like in terms of keywords. Some of the call to actions that we do use with some clients are actually like high priority keywords. So that can be in there, things like get a quote or that kind of thing, or often site links and standalone pages and that sort of thing. So sometimes that does happen. We have tested longer calls to action, like book now and save X amount, so it's not just 2 words. You can go a little bit longer depending on space, layout, device, those sorts of things. So yeah, those can work. Really, a lot of the flexibility around that comes down to the specifics. So like you said, in your case, if prosperity is SEO and content, and the site says that's it, it's what we do, then you could reinforce it there. I don't know what the impact would necessarily be, but it's definitely something that you could consider and kind of run out and see how it goes. So yeah, there are things that you could do like that would fit if not even the call to action button itself. Sometimes there are designs where a headline, tops call to action button. So you kind of do it like a 1-2 punch that way. So yeah, good thinking. There are a couple different ways that you might try something like that. It's good.
Hunter, I just had 2 quick questions.
Yeah.
First, I wanted to
Are you going to do like a 1-2 part, or are we going to do them one at a time?
I think we'll do one at a time. Keep
Yeah,
it
whatever.
I wanted to ask you, there's a lot of experiments and hypothesis, obviously, with the A/B testing within CRO, and sometimes experiments or hypotheses fail or are proven false. How do you communicate any value to the client of potentially a failed A/B test or a hypothesis test? Do you ever consider tests of failure, or just the outcome was different to what you initially thought, and how would you communicate, okay, well, we thought this would happen, it didn't, but now we know this, and that's actually a plus, not a negative to the client?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And it comes up a lot because look, we all like to win, right? So if you look at CRO stats, okay, it's hard to sell CRO based on the stats. A good test win rate, generally, across industries and that sort of, just sort of a blended range, is usually like 13 to 30%.
Okay.
Right. So how this goes back to what I was talking about with how you position CRO as something that's foundational. And it's not a channel like SEO or paid search or email specifically. It's very foundational. It's tied to UX and it's tied to some of these other sorts of things. So, positioning CRO as like a standalone and as that sort of quick wins, and that every test is going to get you the 160% increase in conversions that we got with client A, client B, client C. It's a fine line, right? And so even, like with marketing experiments, and we were showing conversion experiments that had 60% returns, or the case studies that we have with clients where the first year, we've increased revenue 59%, or this test, did this, right? Or with one client, we had an amazing initial run of 75% of our tests outperformed. So like the first 5 out of 7 that we ran over a couple of months, all sort of continued beating the controls for what we did. And that was a test that already had, like that was a site that already had a pretty high conversion rate. They had sort of plateaued with a previous agency, and we took a different approach. We took our approach, and then we started really ramping up the wins. But even with that, over time, it's hard to get, and particularly when it comes to e-commerce. Like a lot of sites these days, and a lot of site templates and models are already heavily optimized. Like Shopify, a lot of that is baked in, right? A lot of the things that sites are using today. So it's hard to get like massive wins all the time. But the flip side of that is understanding that even if you are testing a variant and the control still outperforms it, then that helps to validate what you're doing with your control, right? Yeah. So it may seem like that's a bad result, and it's easy to see why that is. But if you think about that in terms of percentages, that's like expecting, I'll use a basketball analogy again here too, just to pick up on that because it's NBA draft day. It's like expecting your all-star to have a triple-double like every game for the entire season, right? They'll have some great games, they'll have some mid-sized games, they'll have some off games, right? You'll win some, you'll lose some. The idea of winning every single time is like, it's just not how it really works. So when you do find that a couple of tests are not beating the control, you go back and you keep trying to figure out what works. And then you realize that, hey, if the control is performing poorly and you're still underperforming that, that's a different story, right? So if you're doing okay, then it's not quite as bad. Like if you're doing not so good and the tests are failing, that's a bit of a different story. Then you really need to rethink your approach. You need to look at those validity threats, or you need to look at your ideas, or you need to look at, you need to get to the bottom of why and figure out how to adjust your approach. But generally, not every single test is going to win, and not every test even that wins is going to just blow everything out of the water by double or triple digit gains. But those things incrementally in the aggregate, even if you're getting a few that are like 8, 10, 15% here and there, once you move that over from, if it's like an A/B, N, or a multivariate test, if you got 2, 3, 4 variables, and you're doing 30% to 50% of the traffic. If you get one of those small winners, then you put that as the new control, and you get that to 100% of your traffic for the next X amount of time, then those things really start to add up, right? That 10% gain now becomes incrementally larger. So there are ways to think about testing and results positively, even if not every single one is, getting the kinds of results that we like to put as the headline with all of our case studies. You'll find very few agencies or a lot of case studies about, we tried this and it like totally didn't work.
Right. Sure.
Most of us still like to put all that out there because it's fairly easy to pick up the wrong idea. But understanding that those things can happen is just the best you can do.
Definitely. Awesome. This kind of bridges off that. Isn't my second question, but it just came to mind quickly. If you had to throw out a number related to what you would think the average kind of percentage rate is for a win of a CRO test, would you say like 8% increase in conversion from a test is pretty baseline, or something like that, if you can find a way to quantify it off the top of your head?
No, I can't. I wouldn't give you a number. I'd be doing you a disservice to do that. It would just be like, there's so many variables. It's like I said, the kind of average test win rates somewhere between 13 and 30%, but the amount of win in those tests, that's just how long is a piece of string.
True.
Because look, a lot of tests, like we said, are vulnerable to validity threats, and a lot of tests aren't being done right. If you look at the deeper CRO stats, particularly with in-house CRO teams versus agencies, agencies tend to outperform in-house teams. And I think the status on that was probably around average of 34%, but even that, it's not industry specific. There's a lot of the really most valid insights are in the segments and then sort of the granular details. And it's hard to get at that with just kind of throwing like industry-wide numbers out. You know what I mean?
Sure, definitely. Did anyone else have a question, or am I good to ask another one?
Just ask another question, Darcy. That's cool.
Cool. You mentioned Amazon having a lot of traffic and quite a large data set, and
it does. You've heard of it, right?
a lot of having the potential to do like 400 tests a day or something like that. I think you threw
At
out.
least.
Yeah. That's an insane amount of things to optimize for a human on a daily basis. How much potential do you think there is for machine learning and AI within CRO to be making, small tweaks based off pulling in data from heat maps and so forth? Are there quite a few tools that capitalize on machine learning and AI? Is it big in the industry, or definitely still very much a human's job?
Well, that's a really good question. So at the higher end on the enterprise side, first thing I would say is specifically when it comes to Amazon, my buddy Brian Eisenberg and his brother Jeffrey Eisenberg, who've been in this game for years and years and years as well, he really did some solid, deep analysis of what Amazon was doing a few years ago. So I would highly recommend looking into some of the takeaways and some of what they put together around that. So they were also among the pioneers in CRO and super sharp, great guys. So any Amazon related questions, I would always defer. Look up Brian Eisenberg or Brian Jeffrey. They've done some great work on that. There's a lot that I think you could glean from that. When it comes to the machine learning part, we already see Google doing a lot of that within ads, right? And when it's moving to with analytics 4, what the other kind of AI areas that are picking up a lot on the copy side, like copy AI, Jasper, like there's a bunch of tools that are increasingly doing content from an AI perspective. How AI is being rolled into optimization platforms. Unbounce is looking to try and do some machine learning. They just rolled out some things on that front not too long ago. I think it was earlier this year, might have been even a little bit before. Other platforms like VW, Optimizely, it's something that I know that they're all kind of looking at and adding to the mix in different ways and in different degrees. As far as taking advantage of that, each tool is a little bit different, but it is definitely worth looking at. I still like to kind of balance the benefits of AI and machine learning with a human perspective, just from like having, when I started building websites and trying to optimize websites, there wasn't a Google, it was web trends, right? There wasn't split testing. So build a site and upgraded it in around 97. And after the upgrades, tripled the traffic and pretty much doubled the sales leads, right? That was based on like web trends and looking at the analytics and the sort of UX approach. And that I think still holds really a lot of impact and influence. So when it comes to something like Hotjar, for example, and reviewing how humans are using a site in video sessions. Now, AI and machine learning can be a huge help there, because rather than using hours to kind of watch every search in either real time or 2x or 3x, getting some of those aggregated trends is like a really good example of using that to your advantage. But just to specifically do all of it and just sort of hand it all to AI, I don't think that we're there yet. Don't know if and when we will be. I still believe a human element is I might be a little old school for that one, but I still think it's a very important part, because people generally are trying to buy from people. So balancing that out within the tools is something that I think is going to be even more interesting, and where some of these are going ideally should help with making those aspects more efficient, but not just set it and forget it. Does that make sense?
Sure, definitely.
It's a great question too.
Awesome. Thanks, Hunter.
All right. Does anyone have any final questions for Hunter? We appreciate his time today.
I'm all good on my end. Cheers for the call.
Thank you. Yeah, glad we could do it. Thanks for the invite.
How
Really
did you
enjoyed
go with the jewelry project? Did you get that one through?
it. We're still talking. He's taking a bit of a trip. He's going overseas here for a moment, so we'll catch up soon. See how that goes. Some people have managed to do some international travel here now that it's a thing again. So that's good. We had some good chats. Yeah, thanks for that.
Well, we're planning to go to Bali for SEO conference in December. So,
all right.
Yeah,
I'm planning to go there for a vacation before that. So
maybe you have to tell the missus that you've got an event there too that you can tie into the holiday.
that's an idea. Well, yeah, we've got that. We've got that one booked. So I had 2 winters this year because I was in the States for a few months and caught the tail end of winter there, and then came back to Melbourne here. So now I'm very much looking forward to a bit of a warmer scenario in the next couple of weeks there. So yeah.
Oh, nice one. Anyway, Hunter, I really appreciate your time today. It's good to learn more about CRO and all the bits and pieces. I know it's such a big area. I know, it's great to get your insights. So, no, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Likewise, good catching up with you and the team. Really enjoyed it a couple weeks ago and really had a good time today. It's good to talk shopping. It's good stuff.
Yeah.
Good to chat. We'll speak soon, all right?
Sounds good. Thanks all.
Thanks, Hunter.
Thanks, Hunter.
Yeah.
Take care.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.